Dedicated to the survival of American democracy in an increasingly dangerous world, this is Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney, acted as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy under President Ronald Reagan, founder and president of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C., the go-to man for defense and foreign policy issues, joined by the greatest minds in the security policy business, the special forces in the war of ideas at Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney.
Welcome to Secure Freedom Radio. This is Frank Gaffney, your host and guide for what I think of as an intelligence briefing on the war for the free world. I'm not sure I know someone who brings more intelligence to bear on the challenges that this country is facing from enemies, well, as they say, foreign and domestic, than our guest for this very special edition of Secure Freedom Radio. He is Dinesh D'Souza. The various ways of describing his contributions to our country's scholarship, readership, intellectual activity is, well, it's daunting to say the least. He is a writer, a scholar, a professor, a public intellectual, a filmmaker. He unfortunately has a bit of a criminal background, which he describes in a very poignant and very powerful way in his new film, which we've invited him to come aboard to talk about, Hillary's America, the secret history of the Democratic Party. Dinesh D'Souza, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate all you've been doing in all of these capacities, and not least your time with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Good to have you back.
Frank, it's a pleasure to be on the show, and we live at a critical time, and this movie, and there's also an accompanying book of the same title, and the two are kind of my 1-2 punch in trying to put out information that I don't believe is out there, that people don't know, both about the Clintons as well as about the Democratic Party.
Well, I want to really go through this in considerable detail, and I'm so pleased to have the time with you to do it. You start the film with some of your own personal background and the exposure that you had to criminals and their enterprises, which served as a really perfect motif for the larger film. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
This is well, first of all, for a documentary, it's good to have a story. A documentary really works well as a journey, as a kind of quest to find out something. And so, ironically, my incarceration in a federal confinement center on the Mexican border for 8 months overnight, this turned out to be part of the plot. It worked really well, and it is part of my story. The story goes back to 2012 when I gave $20,000 over the campaign finance limit to a college friend of mine who was running for the U.S. Senate. My motive was purely friendship. The candidate didn't even know about it. There was no corruption involved. And normally these cases are just taken to the Federal Election Commission. You get a fine and maybe some community service, but it's not prosecuted as a criminal matter. But Obama and his Justice Department put me in their sights, unleashed a whole bunch of FBI agents on me, and they got me before a Clinton appointee judge who sentenced me to this period of 8 months of overnight incarceration. Well, interestingly there, I kind of got an exposure to an America I'd never seen before, the America of the criminal underclass. And as you say, I take that scene, I stick it right in the movie. It becomes part of my education in learning about how these gangs and criminal rackets operate. And then I use that information and insight to look at politics and look specifically at the Democratic Party and look at the way in which the Democratic Party has skirted around laws and uses, in a sense, its gang operations to collect money, to accumulate power, all at the expense of the American taxpayer.
The fact that you were, in a fashion, really a political prisoner, I guess, is something we might just dwell on before we get back to the movie at the moment, that's our focus, Hillary's America, the secret history of the Democratic Party. And that is, what was it that brought you to the attention, shall we say, of the Obama administration? Might it have had something to do with 2016, Obama's America, or perhaps America Imagine the World Without Her, two of your other films and books?
Well, it would be the former, the earlier film about Obama, because, and I think it's quite obvious that was my incarceration was retribution for that. Right after I made that movie, Obama himself began to rail against the film on his website, barackobama.com. And then a few weeks later, the FBI came knocking on my door. Now, no American has ever been incarcerated for doing what I did. There's another fellow named Chatwal, Asian Indian guy, oddly enough. He gave $180,000 in straw donations to Hillary Clinton and a whole group of Democratic candidates. He went before a judge, no prison, no confinement. And this is a guy who gave, 9 times the amount that I did, and he was found guilty of witness tampering, and he openly boasted about corruption. So my point is, justice isn't just a matter of did you do it, but does the penalty fit the crime? Do other guys who did the same thing get the same penalty? And that's clearly not the case. So progressive justice, if you will, a complete oxymoron, a complete sham. This was a political prosecution, and fortunately I was able to take the lemon and turn it into lemonade.
Yes, you did indeed. And this is really the point of this hour's conversation, is what you were able to do, as you say, to take that personal education, Dinesh D'Souza, and turn it into an opportunity to teach the rest of us about a criminal enterprise on a massive scale. In fact, you describe it as, having as its object stealing America. Talk a little bit about this progressive agenda, which you define so well and dissect in its application.
Well, I was talking to a group of these hoodlums, and I was discussing with them the kind of the interesting idea from the Shawshank Redemption that criminals habitually proclaim and profess their innocence. They never admit they did it. And these guys were like, no, we did it. We're guilty, but we are the small fry. We're the stupid criminals, the fellows who got caught. The big fry are out there. They're at large. They never get caught. And in fact, the system doesn't even go after them because they're too well connected within the system. They run the system. So, fast forward to Bill Clinton meeting with Loretta Lynch, with Obama signaling both to FBI Director Comey and to Lynch, hey, hands off Hillary. She's my gal. I'm turning over the baton to her. I mean, you begin to see how there's a different system of justice that operates for these guys. They run the Justice Department. They know all the top players involved. They can cut deals in private rendezvous. And so this is not the America we want to live in, but this is the America we have now.
Dinesh D'Souza, I want to just sort of begin pulling that apart, if we can, what that agenda really represents, by asking you to talk a little bit about the history of what I think you pretty persuasively argue has been a criminal enterprise going back to the very founding of the Democratic Party. Would you talk about Andrew Jackson and his role in all of this?
Yeah, the founding of the Democratic Party is a kind of a mystery. If you Google it, there was a PBS special on the topic, which completely obfuscates the topic. It starts off by talking about FDR, and you're like, FDR? Wait a minute. There obviously was a Democratic Party before FDR. And then they go back to Thomas Jefferson, and they go, Jefferson. But wait a minute, Jefferson's party was called the Democratic Republican Party. It had nothing to do with what the modern Democratic Party. Later it split, and out of the splits came the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party was founded by Andrew Jackson. Now, there's a lot of controversy about Jackson as an Indian warrior, the Trail of Tears, and so on. But there's an aspect of Jackson that's not well known, but very well documented, and that is the way that Jackson vastly enriched himself through his public office. Essentially what Jackson would do is he would plan to evacuate a group of American Indians, throw them off their land, drive them further west. And that land was supposed to come up for sale, for auction, if you will, to settlers. Now, Jackson would send private surveyors into the land to determine its value, even before the Indians were evacuated. Then he would talk to his buddies, who were investors, and they would put up money and bid on the land before it even came up for public sale. In this way, Jackson went from being dead broke, in Hillary Clinton's phrase, to becoming one of the richest men in the country. Bought a huge slave plantation, which exists to this day in Tennessee. And so it's interesting because when I read about the Clinton Foundation, its shenanigans, its rackets, its sort of selling of public policy and foreign policy, I say, wow, the roots of the Clinton Foundation can be seen in the land-stealing policies of Andrew Jackson.
Fantastically interesting insight. Dinesh D'Souza, we're going to pause for just a moment. We'll be right back with more of the creator of Hillary's America, the secret history of the Democratic Party, and much, much more. Dinesh D'Souza, straight ahead.
Visit us at facebook.com/Secure Freedom with Frank Gaffney.
Hi, this is Frank Gaffney. My day job is running the Center for Security Policy, which each weeknight brings you this program. But Secure Freedom Radio is just one of the important contributions the Center makes to the common defense. We call our team the Special Forces in the War of Ideas. Find out more about the Center for Security Policy and how you can help keep its Special Forces team in the fight by visiting securefreedom.org. Many thanks.
This is Fred Fleitz with the Center for Security Policy. According to the New York Times, President Obama said during a rare visit to the CIA to discuss the second phase in the battle against ISIS on April 13th that the U.S.-led coalition had momentum against ISIS and that ISIS fighters realized their cause is lost. But the previous day, the New York Times ran a story with the headline, ISIS expands reach despite military and financial setbacks, noting that although ISIS has suffered losses on the ground in Iraq and Syria, it has expanded its presence in northern Africa, Afghanistan, and Europe. There also has been little progress in stopping ISIS's efforts to recruit homegrown terrorists worldwide. The president is in denial about the threat from ISIS. His trip to the CIA, which should have occurred 5 years ago when the violence broke out in the Middle East, was little more than a publicity stunt. I'm Fred Fleitz. Learn more at securefreedom.org.
You're listening to Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney from the nation's capital in Washington, D.C.
Welcome back for a very special edition of Secure Freedom Radio. We have a full hour of conversation with one of the most interesting men in America today, a prodigious contributor to the public policy debate in so many different ways, not least, and quite notably, his new film, Hillary's America, The Secret History of the Democratic Party, now playing in, I believe, something on the order of 1,500 theaters around the United States. And congratulations on that, Dinesh. You were talking about Andrew Jackson's involvement with slavery. It turns out that, as you chronicle in Hillary's America, the Democratic Party has had quite a long association with that odious institution, despite the fact that it is widely seen by many contemporary blacks as their party. What's up with that?
Well, the Democratic Party was the party of slavery. Now, I'm not saying that they invented slavery, but what I am saying is that they developed the justifications for it. Politically, they protected it. Now, most people today probably think slavery was a North-South issue. The North was anti-slavery, the South was pro-slavery. But that's a little bit misleading because most Southerners did not own slaves. Most Confederates did not own slaves. And the Northern Democrats, led by Stephen Douglas, vigorously protected slavery. So the slavery debate prior to the Civil War is better understood as a debate between the pro-slavery Democratic Party, North and South, and the anti-slavery Republican Party. This is the way in which progressive Democrats today camouflage their responsibility in an odious institution like slavery. They deflect it onto the South. The South is to blame. And this is what the Democrats do with everything. The South is to blame. America is to blame. America did this. America did that. But, if America did it, it would still be going on. Obviously, some Americans did it, and other Americans stopped them. So the beauty of this movie and the book is that it blows the lid on this whole progressive intellectual cover-up, if you will. Oh, and slavery is just the beginning.
Yeah, and one of the things that, of course, you document is that the Southern folks who were very much involved in this, both before and during, and of course after the Civil War, were Southern Democrats. We're talking with Dinesh D'Souza, the driving force behind Hillary's America. If you have not seen it, I strongly urge you to get out and see it, and take your family and friends, for that matter. Andrew Johnson was another figure in this story that you chronicle in the post-assassination period when Abraham Lincoln was removed from the scene. Talk a bit about his role in helping to sort of exacerbate some of this sort of racial tension that you document so well in the film.
Well, Johnson was Lincoln's vice president, and many people don't know that he was a Democrat, and he's the one who thwarted the idea of reparations, because the Republicans had proposed that confiscated Confederate land after the war be divided up, and some of it given to former slaves so that they could begin a new life, 40 acres and an army mule, if you will. But Johnson and the Democrats conspired together to block that. They issued blanket amnesties, returned the land to the old plantation owners, and there were blacks who actually were on this land, and they had to be evacuated by federal troops. So the reparation scheme that the Republicans attempted was thwarted by the Democrats. And also, interestingly, people talk about the civil rights movement today, and they mean the civil rights movement of the 60s, but the Republicans are the ones who had a huge civil rights movement in the 1860s. This involved the 13th Amendment, permanently abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment, granting equal rights under the law, and the 15th Amendment, granting the right to vote. And the Democrats were bitterly opposed to all three of those amendments. So when Democrats say, we did civil rights, A, that's not true, but B, what they really mean is that we finally came around to supporting the civil rights that we ourselves blocked for 100 years.
Yeah. One of the other rather striking figures in all of this, which you again depict brilliantly, and I just want to say, I think what you've created kind of as a genre, Dinesh, is a film that combines a little bit of your own personal story and your narrative with the classic documentary interviews with the talking heads, but also some very well done, very high quality reenactments of key moments, and your treatment of Woodrow Wilson as a figure that was a prominent bad actor in some of this story, I suspect would be among the least known of Americans. Talk a little bit about his role as president.
Yeah, the idea, Frank, of reenactments actually got from the movie Titanic, when the woman is looking at the jewel, and then you kind of go inside the story that the jewel represents. And we use that technique in this movie as well. Now, after slavery, the Democrats became the champions of segregation. And again, people say, well, you can't just generalize like that, Dinesh. Well, yes, I can. Every segregation law, without exception, was passed by a Democratic legislature and signed by a Democratic governor. There is actually no exception to that rule. Woodrow Wilson, as a progressive in the early 20th century, represents both the segregationist side of the Democratic Party. He extended segregation in the government, but he also represents the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Because by airing an infamous movie, Birth of a Nation, a movie in which the Ku Klux Klan is the hero, at the White House, he inspired a Klan revival that spread beyond the South into the Midwest, into the West. And so this is actually pretty remarkable. We think of Wilson as this internationalist, the League of Nations, and so on. But this other side of Wilson is very important and represents the way that the left made a transition from being just the party of segregation to also being the party of so-called progressivism. Progressivism in this case involving social engineering, social Darwinism, eugenics, and all kinds of other sordid and murderous schemes.
Mm-hmm. He, of course, was not alone in all of this, but it is rather striking that his reputation is pretty strongly that of a man who was on the progressive side. And I guess that's what really comes across so powerfully in this film is the rather checkered, shall we say, attitude of and agenda of progressives, as they've from time to time called themselves, alternating, I guess, between that and liberals.
Hillary was asked recently if she was a liberal, and she goes, "No, I'm an early 20th century progressive." And the term progressive, to the innocent, is sort of like, well, it's obviously about progress. But the progressives meant something by that term. it wasn't just generically progress. Progress in what direction? Well, for them, it meant progress in terms of complete centralization of power and social control. Control not just over your pocketbook, but over your ordinary life. And so Margaret Sanger, for example, one of the early progressives, founder of Planned Parenthood, kind of heroine to Hillary Clinton, who got the Sanger Award in 2009 in Houston, and, proclaimed the virtues of Margaret Sanger. Well, Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist and somebody who, people say, well, she just wanted people to space their pregnancy. She wanted people to have fewer children. No, she wanted wealthy white people, educated people to have more children. And she wanted poor brown and black people to have no children. And she supported schemes like forced sterilization for that to happen. She was even an inspiration for the early Nazi sterilization laws in the 1930s. So this horrid woman who had a Negro project to reduce the size of the black population is actually a contemporary inspiration and heroine to an aspiring president of the United States.
Yeah, I think one of the real high points of this film was the drill down that you did on Sanger and her Negro project, as she called it, and then that really chilling sort of endorsement of her by Hillary Clinton. It couldn't have been more direct and categorical.
And we see that this is not. See, some people think that, Dinesh, you're doing history. This is stuff that occurred in the past. Wait a minute. We show in the film that there are the recordings of phone calls to Planned Parenthood where guys are saying, how about if I give you money just to eliminate black babies? There's just too many blacks around. What if we want to reduce the black population? And the people from Planned Parenthood are like, great, yeah, absolutely, we'll do it. Yeah, we're for it.
That was before they got on to body parts, which was a whole nother story. Hey, Dinesh, we have to pause for just a second. We'll be right back with more right after this.
Visit us at facebook.com/securefreedom with Frank Gaffney.
This is Frank Gaffney with the Secure Freedom Minute. There he goes again. President Obama sent $400 million to the mullahs in Tehran in what appears to be the latest in a continuing effort to appease and enrich some of our most dangerous enemies. Predictably, what amounts to a ransom payment for American hostages has prompted the Iranian regime to seize more. Speaking of American funds helping our enemies, Representative Mike Pompeo of Kansas has launched a congressional inquiry into the $700,000 in contributions to National Public Radio by a group that slavishly promoted the mullah's line on Mr. Obama's fraudulent nuclear deal with Iran. Even NPR's own internal watchdog was concerned about the apparent connection between the money given to the network by the Plowshares Fund and the favorable treatment NPR gave to its pro-Iran propaganda. All those helping Iran become more dangerous must be held accountable. This is Frank Gaffney.
Now more with Frank Gaffney.
Our guest is Dinesh D'Souza. You have doubtless seen his films. I hope you have, at least. You've almost certainly read his books or seen him in the public arena, commenting, analyzing, teaching magnificently, really. We're talking today about his new film, Hillary's America, The Secret History of the Democratic Party. And Dinesh, to move from the early 20th century to the 30s, of course, we had progressivism institutionalized, and really that central planning kind of approach enshrined in the New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Talk a little bit about how the Democratic Party sort of mutated in that period and the extent to which some of these rather nasty traditions and historical proclivities were embedded in it as well.
Well, progressive historians like to portray FDR as a transition away from the old democratic practices of segregation and the Ku Klux Klan and all that stuff. But, in fact, it's not true. FDR incorporated all that into his progressive coalition. FDR, in order to pass the New Deal, needed the support of the racist Democrats, a huge coalition in the Democratic Party. So he goes to those guys and he goes, I'll give you the Tennessee Valley Project, I'll give you this, I'll give you that, vote for the New Deal. And those guys were like, no, we'll support the New Deal only if, A, you agree to block all anti-lynching schemes that are introduced by the Republicans. FDR agrees. And then they say, all right, condition number 2, you have to agree to exclude blacks who mainly work in domestic service as maids and so on. and in agricultural labor, exclude those two categories from New Deal programs. No Social Security for those people, for example. FDR agrees again. So, point is, here's this progressive icon of the 20th century, FDR, and he's in bed with the worst racists in this country, cutting deals that actually have not only a racist motive, but a racist effect. And the New Deal was in that sense, marinated in bigotry.
Mm-hmm. And yet it's during that period that, as you chronicle, Dinesh D'Souza, so many blacks came to find themselves identifying with the Democratic Party after having, for many years before, and quite understandably, found their home in the party of Abraham Lincoln, the Republicans.
This is a great kind of a mystery and a very tragic story of how many blacks knew they were leaving the party of emancipation in Lincoln and joining the party of segregation in the Ku Klux Klan. And it is only the unbelievably harsh conditions of the Depression that can explain why people would make such a transition, because what they got was so meager and so little. But nevertheless, they, in a sense, sold their legacy in exchange for in most cases, not even actual benefits, but just promises of the New Deal.
And the promises of the New Deal were a mixed bag, as they, in fact, were delivered, including, I'm afraid, sort of a continuation of this democratic tradition of exploitation of the blacks, would it not be?
I think we see that now. I mean, now with the benefit of about 70 or 80 years of hindsight, as we look back to see how this has all played out, we see what the Democrats were really doing is they were not offering lasting benefits, or they weren't actually offering ladders of opportunity. What they were doing, almost diabolically, was recreating the plantation in the inner city. In other words, they were taking the features of plantation life. Let's look at a couple of those. Ramshackle dwellings, broken families, a great deal of violence required to hold the place together. Everybody gets a meager living, but no one really gets ahead. There's nihilism, hopelessness, and despair. These were the features of the old rural slave plantation. These are exactly the features of life today in inner city Oakland, Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, St. Louis. So the Democrats essentially made the plantation an urban phenomenon and expanded it. So it wasn't just for blacks anymore, but if there are plantations for blacks, reservations for Native Americans, ghettos, barrios, and slums for Hispanics and other minorities. And this is the kind of legacy of the party. Remember, the Democrats were running the old slave plantations, and they're running the new urban plantations. You can't blame any of the problems today on the Republicans, because in these places, there's not a Republican to be found. Democratic mayors, Democratic city officials, Democratic sheriffs. It's Democrats all the way down.
Right. And building on what you've documented, Dinesh D'Souza, in Hillary's America, the practices of machine politics in these urban centers, dominated typically by white boss tweed types, but not exclusively. Richard Daley features prominently in the film. What role did they play in perpetuating this sort of, or transplanting and sort of institutionalizing this plantation in the urban centers?
The role of the bosses, and here we need to be fair, there were some Republican bosses, there were some Republican machines, but in the main, the urban city machine was an ethnic Democratic phenomenon. Tammany Hall being one example, the Daley racket in Chicago being another. And these urban bosses, essentially what they would do is A, loot the treasury, B, give city contracts to their buddies and friends, and C, create a kind of dependent class of people who were essentially reliant on them for their jobs and for their livelihoods. And I think what the Clintons represent today is taking the corruption that was previously at the local level and taking it to the national or even the global level. We've never seen that in America before. The ability, for example, for someone who's Secretary of State, Hillary, to profit from her position. I mean, the Clintons essentially went from $0 to $300 million on a government salary. I mean, is there even a plausible way to imagine how that could legitimately occur? I don't think so. And so we're seeing the old boss tweed model, if you will, but now carried to the White House, carried to the Secretary of State. American security and foreign policy is involved. It's almost chilling to contemplate.
Let me ask you about another man who I believe profited immensely during his time in public office, namely Lyndon Baines Johnson.
Well, Johnson was initially started out as a segregationist. He was a racist. And he was someone, however, who realized that the politics of the South were changing. And the South was actually becoming less racist, and the non-racist Southerners were moving toward the Republican Party. So Johnson decided in order to be viable in the South, we need black votes. And so he got this idea of essentially keeping blacks on the Democratic plantation. The transition that began with FDR, of blacks voting Democratic, Johnson was worried that would be reversed. And so he wanted to accelerate it. And so his idea for the Great Society was to create more dependency.
Fantastically interesting. When you look at the Johnson legacy with respect to civil rights, it certainly had the effect, whatever else it did, of further intensifying the attachment of many black Americans to the Democratic Party. You've really made the case, I think very persuasively, Dinesh, that this is a con game, among other things. How have the Democrats responded to the loyalty of blacks in your estimation? I'm thinking of the period leading up to and including now the election of an African American as president of the United States.
Yeah, the thing is that with blacks, they became, in a sense, beholden to the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party realized that we can take these people for granted. Not only do we not need to demonstrate economic progress, particularly for the poorest blacks, we don't actually want it. Because think about it. Frequently, there are these gentrification schemes that are proposed for the inner city. Hey, let's bring in new apartments, lofts, high-tech companies, Starbucks. Let's create all kinds of new jobs and ladders of opportunity. And the progressives fight tooth and nail against this. They always, you're changing the neighborhood. What they actually mean is that if there were ladders of opportunity, people might climb up them, dust themselves off, and walk off, and they don't need the Democratic Party anymore. Goodbye. Let's move out. So the Democrats don't like that. They want to keep these voters in there because they can count on, and this is the irony of the plantation.
We have to pause on that thought. We will be right back with more with Dinesh D'Souza, the author of Hillary's America, also Obama's America, Unmaking the American Dream, right after this.
Go to securefreedomradio.org today. It's your freedom. It's your country. Frank Gaffney's Secure Freedom Radio.
Hi, this is Frank Gaffney. My day job is running the Center for Security Policy, which each weeknight brings you this program. But Secure Freedom Radio is just one of the important contributions the Center makes to the common defense. We call our team the Special Forces in the War of Ideas. Find out more about the Center for Security Policy and how you can help keep its Special Forces team in the fight by visiting securefreedom.org. Many thanks.
Go to securefreedomradio.org today. It's your freedom. It's your country. Frank Gaffney's Secure Freedom Radio.
Our guest for this full hour, very gracious in giving us so much of his time, is Dinesh D'Souza, much in demand at the moment as America, I think, is clamoring to learn more about his new film, which we are profiling here today, Hillary's America, the secret history of the Democratic Party. And Dinesh, I just wanted to hone in on this point. There has really been a bait and switch on these, folks who have largely been condemned to life on the urban plantation. The opportunities to get out, notwithstanding the endless promises of more jobs and guaranteed right to progress, has been pretty appalling and condemning most of these folks to a perpetual sort of confinement in this plantation. Talk a bit about that, if you would.
The Democrats make sure that many of the people on the urban plantation aren't really capable of doing any jobs. Remember that under slavery, the Democrats were mainly stealing these people's labor. That's what they were doing. Now they don't want to steal their labor. They want their votes. That's what they want. And so in order to do that, they've got to keep a perpetual dependency. The urban pastor, Eugene Rivers, a black guy from the Boston area, made a astounding statement a few years ago. He said, when I look at these inner city blacks, these black males, he goes, they don't even have the skills to be useful slaves. Now, this was a startling statement, but what he meant was that if you are a slave, you're a mason or a weaver or you're an agricultural worker, and when slavery ends, you have skills that are actually marketable. The people who are actually useless are the masters who don't know how to do anything, but the slaves do. And his point is, when I look at the inner city now, you have people, and the people say, well, they need jobs. But, can you imagine these guys showing up for work, even at McDonald's, punching a clock, respecting authority, taking orders, being cordial to customers? They don't even know how to do that. So the Democrats have created this completely, if you will, dependent, subservient class because their only interest in these people, again, is their votes.
For which they typically get paid or some other form of compensation to provide the votes. And that feeds this racket, doesn't it, Dinesh? This is kind of the game that is sort of endlessly ongoing with the public trough being the purveyor of the payment.
And now it's extending to immigrants. The whole immigration debate to me is miscast. I mean, I'm an immigrant. I think America can and should have a generous immigration policy. The real question is, what kind of immigrants do we want? Do we want immigrants who want to assimilate to the American dream, who want to be productive members of society? That's the immigrants we want. That's the immigrants the Democrats do not want. They want immigrants who will sort of join the ghettos, the barrios, the slums, immigrants who essentially become serfs of the Democratic Party, so that they can, in a sense, corral them into new types of plantations, extending their social control.
And, this may sound like hyperbole, but I think this is, again, something that can be, and you have done a lot to document. And, going back to I believe it was 1965 Immigration Reform Act, and sort of turning on its head this whole idea that what we want are people who want to add real value to the country and be part of it, as you say. We've got instead now masses of people who don't.
And the Democrats always try to erase the line between legal and illegal immigration. And this is part of their big campaign against Trump, is that they're saying, he's against immigration. Well, there's an important distinction between people who go through the system, stand in line, are properly vetted, and people who essentially swim the Rio Grande. So that's a totally different deal. And many of us who are legal immigrants who have taken the trouble to go through the system and respect the fact that we're a nation under law, don't like the notion of people jumping the fence.
Of particular concern to me, I must say, is the idea that in addition to trying to import large numbers of people who are unlikely to assimilate, shall we say, there now seems to be a special effort being made, particularly by Barack Obama, to import people who we know will not assimilate, who couldn't be more clear about their refusal to assimilate, namely adherence to Sharia. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Well, we see from the European example that within liberal societies, and I'm using the phrase liberal here in the small L sense of the term, the people who are the most indigestible are the Muslims. Can a Pakistani, become an Englishman? Can a Turk become a German? Can a Kuwaiti become a Frenchman? The Europeans are discovering that this is a very difficult, I won't say impossible, it's certainly a very difficult process. So it doesn't seem to be a process that we should be inviting in this country. Now, again, I'm not saying for 1 minute that Muslims can't come to America or that they can't become U.S. citizens. No. But what I am saying is that this notion of sort of almost recklessly and defiantly promoting Islamic immigration to America seems to me to make no sense. What does America gain from this? Why are we pursuing this project? So it looks to me that with the Democrats and Obama, it's almost like an ideological retribution against the Republicans. And Obama's an ideological guy. This is the important thing to realize, the distinction between Obama and Hillary. is at the end of the day, Obama is an ideologue. His ideology, I think, is pathetic, it's twisted, it's destructive, but there it is. He believes it. He actually thinks that this is the way to go. With Hillary and Bill, you're dealing more with Bonnie and Clyde. These are people who have been on the make and on the take since the Arkansas days, going through the White House where they were, renting out the Lincoln bedroom, taking curios off the desks and pictures off the wall, later being forced to return some of them, selling pardons to big-time racketeers, tax cheats, and felons and criminals. The Clintons, in this sense, are a different breed than Obama, and I think should be understood differently. Hillary's America will look a little different than Obama's America.
And yet, you make a very powerful case, I think, in the film, Dinesh, that Hillary is imbued with some of the same ideological DNA as Obama, notably your profile of her relationship with Saul Alinsky. Would you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, Alinsky is the bridge between Obama and Hillary. Interestingly, Hillary's relationship with Alinsky far stronger than Obama's. Alinsky died in 1972. Obama never knew him, never met him. Obama studied under the Alinskyites. Hillary, however, knew Alinsky, met him in high school, brought him to Wellesley College when she was a student there, wrote her thesis on him. Now, interestingly, when Bill Clinton got up and gave his big Rapunzel fairy tale story of Hillary at the Democratic National Convention, conveniently omitted any mention of Alinsky at all, even though Alinsky was so instrumental in the transition that Hillary made from being a Goldwater girl to being a left-wing ideologue. Now, the side of Alinsky I want to stress that I discuss in the movie, but even at more length in the book, Hillary's America, is the notion of Alinsky not just as a radical ideologue, but as a kind of a thief and a gangster. This side of Alinsky is not well known at all, even though Alinsky himself talks about it. In interviews he gave very late in life, Alinsky said, "I was a petty thief on the streets of Chicago. Later, when I went to the University of Chicago, I developed a sort of a robbery scheme to eat free in cafeterias." And he even conducted seminars on how to steal from the university and while he was a student there. Then later on, he goes on and gets involved in all these gangs, culminating in the Al Capone gang.
Yeah,
where he
did an internship with Al Capone, right?
Yeah, he becomes friends with Al Capone's enforcer, the number 2 guy, Frank Nitti, and he actually talks openly about how he admired the way that the Capone mob used to extort money from people, the only downside being that mobsters sometimes got knocked off. And then Alinsky goes, "I figured out that if I could do this in politics, if I could apply these same lessons to politics, essentially he could be an extortionist without getting knocked off." So it's actually remarkable to contemplate that current President Obama and our aspiring next President Hillary are tutored at the feet of this self-acknowledged gangster.
We're going to pause at that point and come back to our final segment with Dinesh D'Souza, in which we'll talk about what Hillary taught Saul Alinsky about the great crime against America. Right after this.
Go to securefreedomradio.org today. It's your freedom. It's your country. Frank Gaffney's Secure Freedom Radio.
Hi, this is Frank Gaffney. My day job is running the Center for Security Policy, which each weeknight brings you this program. But Secure Freedom Radio is just one of the important contributions the Center makes to the common defense. We call our team the Special Forces in the War of Ideas. Find out more about the Center for Security Policy and how you can help keep its Special Forces team in the fight by visiting securefreedom.org. Many thanks.
Go to securefreedomradio.org today. It's your freedom. It's your country. Frank Gaffney's Secure Freedom Radio.
We're back. Again, visiting with Dinesh D'Souza, a force of nature when it comes to his ability to bring his intellectual ability to bear in exposing and clarifying what's going on in our country. We're talking most immediately about his terrific new film, Hillary's America, The Secret History of the Democratic Party, which, again, I commend to all of you. And I just wanted to pick up on one other point, which I thought was very well done in the film, Dinesh, and that is what you discovered the young acolyte to Saul Alinsky taught the master about how to effect kind of revolutionary change.
Yeah, Hillary was, she kind of upended Alinsky, outmastered the master, if you will, because Alinsky's whole thesis was that extortionists should be on the outside of government. They should be on the outside banging on the door, pressuring city government or pressuring corporations to give in to their demands. And Hillary had a thought, and that was, wait a minute, what if we are on the inside of government? What if all the apparatus of government is at our beck and call? Today we live in a country where the post office has a SWAT team and the Bureau of Land Management has a SWAT team. So if we have all the power of government in our command, the IRS, the FBI, we then are terrifyingly more effective than if we're just outsiders a la Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton banging on the door. So Hillary kind of outsmarted Alinsky and took the Alinsky strategy, you might say, inside of government.
And as you look at where she would go if, in fact, God forbid, Hillary's America eventuates, give us just a sense of what would be our fate.
I think the way to understand Hillary, and this is also a good way to understand Benghazi. Think about Hillary's, infamous, irritable, what difference does it make? How do we make sense emotionally of what she was saying there? Well, I think the way to do that is to imagine two people who are robbing Fort Knox. This is what they do. This is why they're in government. They're robbing Fort Knox. And then people come running in and say, oh, we need medical attention over here. Oh, that guy's life is in danger over there. Oh, can you help and sign this memo? Oh, can you unleash? And the attitude of Hillary is, hey, don't bother me. I'm robbing Fort Knox. Can't you see I'm robbing Fort Knox? So the point is that the Clintons are so absorbed in their own personal advancement, and they see foreign policy as a way to do that. We give examples in the movie of how they are reckless with the acquisition of American uranium assets, selling them off essentially to Canadian billionaires, Russian oligarchs, ultimately companies controlled by Vladimir Putin. How they intercept aid money that's intended for Haiti. Hillary is Secretary of State. Bill is the head of the UN Commission for Haiti aid relief. A lot of that money never gets to Haiti. It swells the coffers of the Clinton Foundation. I mean, it's one thing to rob from rich people, but the Clintons will even rob from poor people. And so to me, with the difference between Hillary and Obama is Obama wants to reduce America's wealth and power. This is his ideological objective. With Hillary, you have people who are basically on the take. They don't care about domestic policy. They don't care about foreign policy. Everything is secondary to their own insatiable ambitions and appetites. And that's what I'm afraid we're up for if Hillary is allowed back into the White House.
Chilling thought, indeed. Hey, Dinesh, let me close this examination of our history and politics and the practice of politics by the Democratic Party particularly by asking you to assess, as an historian is particularly capable of doing, the Obama legacy. As you say, his interest in transforming America on the one hand and altering its relationship with the rest of the world is probably going to be the leitmotif of this presidency. But what do you think is going to be best remembered of it from, future historians?
Well, it's very eye-opening to go back to the film I made 4 years ago, 2016, and watch it now. Because in that film, I made predictions about Obama. And in foreign policy, I said that Obama will not only weaken our national defense, but he will strengthen our enemies and weaken our allies. Now, we can just clinically look to see if that's the case. Mubarak was our ally in Egypt. He's gone. Gaddafi wasn't our ally, but he was doing business with us. He's gone. Assad is not our friend. He's our enemy, and he's in power. The mullahs in Iran are very definitely our adversary. They're even stronger than ever. So simply as a matter of Euclidean fact, the truth of it is that this result has in fact been accomplished. American influence in the Middle East is much less. It used to be that not a whole lot could happen in the world without the Americans say-so. Obama has ensured that this is no longer the case, and groups like ISIS have arisen out of that vacuum. So this is the terrible, measurable Obama legacy, weakening America in the world. And this is why we are at a point where we need a certain kind of American restoration. We don't need to bring in the Clinton duo who are going to, in a somewhat different way, but nevertheless continue this project of American erosion, American decline.
When you look at this in particular, I wonder what you make of the efforts he's undertaken to transform America as a nation. as a sovereign nation in particular. And I'm thinking, as an example of this, the controversy that is likely to preoccupy us at least after the election, namely over the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Have you taken a look at that? And more broadly, what do you make of his likely legacy in this area?
I think we see with Obama something that we hadn't seen before, which is we see a president, and I think I did call him right on this in my early book, The Roots of Obama's Rage. I said, look, most Americans, most presidents, Republican or Democrat, are within America, and they look at America and the world from inside America. Obama, oddly enough, although born in America, sees himself as kind of a world figure. He's outside America. America is this sort of petulant child making demands on him, and he imperiously gets to decide, well, that's reasonable. Well, that's not reasonable. I'm not going to go along with that. So Obama, in a sense, is not looking out for America. You never get the feeling that he is aggressively protecting America's interests. You get the feeling that he's some sort of a world referee, if you will, applying a kind of moral lens to decide if America deserves these claims being impetuously pressed forward. So that is a very, to me, un-American project that Obama represents. And whether Hillary will continue that, I'm not really sure. But what I am sure is that this has actually been the legacy of the past 8 years.
Hey, Dinesh, let me ask you one other question, which is there's a lot of talk now, and indeed it is a project of the Koch brothers to make it a bipartisan initiative. Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, has indicated he intends to push forward with it in September, namely the so-called criminal justice reform initiative. Have you looked at this, and do you have any thoughts on how transformative this might be, and in what ways?
I do. Before I address that, if I may say so, Frank, Hillary's America, the movie.com is the website for the film. You can watch a trailer, and if you plug in your zip code, it'll tell you where the movie is playing near you. The book of the same title available everywhere. Okay, turning to criminal justice, there's a lot that does need to be done. I do think that our system is flawed and broken. Now, most of the emphasis is on things like excessive penalties for drug crimes. But in my experience and my observation, having been in the confinement center, a lot of our criminal justice problems are in other areas. For example, the way in which the plea bargain system is used to actually bludgeon even innocent people into pleading guilty. Hey, doctor, we're going to charge you with illegally administering pain medicine. And it's a questionable case. You might win, but if you lose, we're going to put you away for 5 years and you'll never be able to practice medicine again. But if you plead guilty, we'll give you 6 months and you'll pay a fine and then you can go back to your medical practice. Well, even an innocent guy is going to plead guilty under those circumstances. So prosecutors have unbelievable discretionary power to lock up the guilty and the innocent alike.
There's so much more to talk about, and yet we are at the end of this time. Dinesh D'Souza, thank you for the film. Thank you for your clarity on so many of these issues and your courage in conveying them to us. Please, again, folks, check out Hillary's America, The Secret History of the Democratic Party, in both the video form and book as well. And keep up the good work, my friend. Come back to us again if you would very soon. I hope the rest of you will do so tomorrow, same time, same station. Until then, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks for listening.
From the nation's capital, you've been listening to Secure Freedom Radio with Frank Gaffney.